So, without further ado, I will introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Tammam, a Syrian-Swiss physician currently serving as the CEO for the new Humanitarian, the leading humanitarian newsroom reporting from the heart of crisis. With over 2 decades of experience at the forefront of international humanitarian organizations, Dr. Tammam is a leading advocate for decolonizing global health and advancing humanitarianism. He began his humanitarian career as a volunteer for the Syrian Red Crescent, then went on to work with the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies in Iraq after the invasion in 2003. Over the last 20 years, he has worked in emergencies ranging from conflicts and forced displacement to disasters and disease outbreaks, from Darfur to the Indian Ocean tsunami to the Haiti earthquake. His most recent role was as president of MSF Netherlands and as a member of MSF's international board. Let's welcome Dr. Tammam to the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, I am privileged to give a keynote today in the Humanitarian Leadership Conference. I want to express my gratitude to the Center of Humanitarian Leadership and the Center of Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. In particular, I'd like to thank Mariana Magleson for the inspiration and confidence she has accepted to let me speak without reading my speech first. As mentioned, I have the privilege of working for the new Humanitarian, and having come to this from more than 20 years in the humanitarian sector, I have both the desire to be able to speak out and to explore the limits of where can we go with a sector that has struggled for much of its history, even if those struggles were not always apparent. Over the past few weeks, the humanitarian sector was boiling with apprehension, even with panic, at the catastrophic cut in aid by the US administration. The system will collapse is what you would hear if you were walking the corridors of humanitarian power. Yet the reaction is a chorus of voices from humanitarian leaders who were repeating some old and tired solutions. We are told again that humanitarianism will reform, as if it hasn't been reforming for the past 15 years. We are also told that we will certainly localize and now give power to choose your preferred option, communities, local organizations, people on the front line, or whatever is fashionable. Do you hear the echoes of 2015? We are told that we will prioritize better and be more efficient. The prioritization argument has been there before, and below its surface, it hides a problematic proposition. This is one where governments who are denying aid delegate the choices of who lives and who dies to civil society. We are asked to cut down treatments, rations, programs, and medicines and education. When we do that, we will be told, see, you can do more with less. You are welcome. No one then will count the people who died on the way. There is little evidence that any of those solutions would work beyond buying the system some time. My late father used to repeat an Arabic proverb, اللي بيجرب المجرب بيكون عقله مخرب, which would loosely translate to the English, insanity is trying the same thing and expecting a different result. I don't see much being proposed beyond the same formula that has been tested and has not worked before. It is now time to talk about what radical humanitarian leadership should be at this juncture, and how could we bring humanitarianism from its current crisis, or to follow the turn of phrase, from its polycrisis of lack of funding and of a precarious moral position. To do so, such humanitarian leadership should care more about the purpose of humanitarianism than its vessel, about the function rather than the system, and about people who need it rather than people who pay for it. I will jump ahead and say that the solution is not deleting a list of words from your websites. You know what I'm talking about. It's not courting transnational corporations for more money without forethought and scrutiny. It is not more tokenistic gestures towards the global south without an actual change. It is certainly not firing local staff, cutting programs, and reducing deliverables while keeping the same people in the same places at top of organizations. It is not more silent. It is not more silence as the normative basis of humanitarianism and of humanity get dismantled, genocide gets normalized, buying weapons become more important than buying food, or as the Financial Times puts it, approvingly, by the way, moving from the welfare state to the warfare state. To me, thinking about possible futures brings back old memories of my 2 decades as a humanitarian worker. From the day on my first mission, and I say that sarcastically, when I landed in occupied Baghdad in 2003, shortly after the US invasion of Iraq, where an American GI looked confusedly at my passport and asked his officer, "Can a Syrian be a humanitarian worker?" To lines of hundreds of trucks carrying refugees in Somaliland East in 2007 or 8, before it was called a refugee crisis, because it wasn't coming to Europe. Then to working in Northeast Syria, my own country, during the war and coming to terms with being both an expatriate and a local in a system that sharply differentiates the two. To a few months ago in South Darfur, the conflict that continues to rage and barely makes the news, where I saw stunted children who didn't grow and continued to die while humanitarian organizations sat on the border and waited for permissions. I have, for much of my years as a humanitarian, convinced myself that we are and should be a Band-Aid, that for people to strive for more, they need to survive first, that we saved lives, so those who are saved can have better chance of a dignified life and a better future. I do struggle to believe that anymore. I do still believe that every life is worthy of saving and preserving. But I cannot accept that the way it is done now is just. The difference in narratives and resources allocated to places like Ukraine and Sudan, the difference in attention afforded to the rich and affluent and to the poor and racialized, the acceptance of systemic dehumanization of Palestinians, migrants, indigenous people, and much of the majority world, while being polite to those who are perpetrating their dehumanization and suffering. The lines between neutrality and complicity are too often blurry. I want to talk to you about a few delusions that seem to have become normal in humanitarian discourse. The first delusion is that all was well and that the aid cut by Trump administration has been the trigger for our problems. All was not well. After all, we have been fine until last January. There have been years of reductions in aid budgets by Western liberal states and expansion, on the other hand, of defense expenditure and tax cuts for the rich. Yet I would go a step further and say the problem is not aid budgets altogether, it is not the money. There is plenty of money. The United States spent $1 billion in the past month bombing Yemen. $1 billion. That is the budget of the new humanitarian for 250 years. The problem is not lack of money. It is, for better or for worse, the apparent rapid fall of capitalist liberalism. It is the liberal states don't seem to believe in the rhetoric they have spent decades pushing on the rest of us. The necessary condition of the functioning of humanitarianism, an acknowledgement of common humanity, and the need for international collaboration and solidarity seem to be disappearing. The second delusion is that the survival of people we serve requires the survival of the system as it is constructed now. In the past weeks, I have heard the expression system collapse with increased frequency, said by people with worried expressions and anxious voices. It is ironic that we only wake up to the failures of the system when it affects our budgets and our headquarters. The system did not collapse when or because of the meager aid budgets being cut. The system collapsed for many people long ago, for indigenous, racialized, and expropriated people in the South and in the south of the North, for the poor and wretched of the earth when the narratives of the rich became the norm, for the slain men, women, and children, unnamed and unnarrated, when their killers are celebrated and granted impunity. The system collapsed when it left Congolese, Sudanese, Syrians, Rohingyas, and Palestinians, among others, succumb to conflicts that could have been stopped and instead were justified and wavered upon. It collapsed when leaders promised to stop the climate catastrophe only to turn their backs and double down on pollution. It collapsed when humanitarians remained silent. Yet people survive. We conflate humanitarianism that people and communities provide to each other with the humanitarian regime, which is yet to stand and speak up unequivocally for those who suffer against those who perpetrate the suffering. The final delusion is that we as humanitarians, practitioners, journalists, leaders, authorities, and donors are at the same distance of all parties. This one is particularly malicious. Humanitarianism is well-meaning. Humanitarians are selfless, and humanitarian action saves lives. But that doesn't change the fact that the humanitarian system, as it stands now, is a product of colonial, patriarchal, and capitalist histories and trajectories. The delusion here is that there has been a golden age of humanitarianism that we only need to restore. We, for God's sake, do not need to make humanitarianism great again. I'm going to try and contextualize to counter these delusions. The US administration's aid cuts are but the latest and most vulgar symptom in what has become a chronic disease. I will go further and say that all the reductions of aid turn to more militarism and force at the cost of international solidarity is in itself a symptom of another chronic condition. That is the decay, if not the end, of the Western established liberal international order. The liberal international order is not a benevolent order. The basis of it, individualism, free markets, and Western-style democracy, have been repeatedly and consistently used to cover for extraction of resources, political and economic hegemony, exploitation, and expropriation. Yet that order is the condition of necessity for the humanitarian system we have. Without it, we cannot hope to cover our budget deficits and go on like before. The dismantling of the normative frameworks of international law and the current toxic mix of ethno-nationalism and capitalist extraction leave no space or necessity for the current form of humanitarianism. This is not a problem that will be solved with the next US administration. It is not an issue of resupplying the coffers. It goes beyond that. The world seems to be hell-bent on getting rid of soft power, moving towards more conflict, both military and economic. Humanitarianism have always functioned in the overlap of needs of those exploited and expropriated and the interest of those who have money, mainly Western liberal states. This humanitarian compromise has always been precarious, but it helps save lives. We shook hands and receive funds from the same people who dropped bombs and ordered attacks. We gave them moral cover as long as they gave us access and space. We saved lives. Now they seem to care less for moral cover, soft power, or the pretense of benevolence. They seem to care less for the normative frameworks and international law they have created. They look at Gaza, Sudan, Syria, the DRC, and the millions of people living with HIV, fleeing violence, or suffering hunger, and shrug their shoulders. Those are not their voters and not their intended audiences. So what are we to do if the liberal condition of possibility for the humanitarian system is disappearing? What we seem to be doing, instinctively and out of fear and panic, is to push further the same ways we always did. Ask for more funding, show more photos of starving children, talk about ourselves, compete for whatever donors are willing to give, all while promising efficiency and doing more with less. I do not believe this will work. What might work, on the other hand, is a new humanitarian community that is not designed from above, but that is a confederation of grassroots and local organizations that dictate the rules rather than receive them. A humanitarian community that is contextualized, fiercely local, and politically engaged, that resists dehumanization and extraction, that stands up to the hegemony of power politics, and that collaborates rather than competes. A humanitarian community that is part of a wider resistance to, rather than cover for, ecological destruction, economic exploitation, and the injustices inflicted on racialized, gender, and expropriated people in the name of helping them. This might seem like a tall order. It goes beyond having a DEI policy or reducing your carbon footprint or having more Zoom calls rather than flights. It goes far beyond. It is a tall order because organizations have staff to pay and programs to run. But I fear this kind of direction is not anymore a radical dream. It is a necessity. It is a necessity for the survival of humanitarianism and for the people it serves. Thank you very much.